Welcome very much. We've had a little difficulty in getting the stream up and going. It's streaming now. It's also being recorded on the tape, and it'll be able to be a good copy of this evening with Howard Bloom. And Howard Bloom was to be our speaker last Monday. That would have been the 29th, the same day that Sandy hit with such vehemence and threw everything into a cocked hat. He agreed to come again tonight to talk, and it's a little hard to know how to introduce him. He is the author of a recent book, which I was unable to put down because it was so very well written, covered the intellectual history of much of the Western and world civilization. I'll show the book here. I'll be happy to do it. It's called The God Problem, How A Godless Cosmos Creates. An extremely interesting read that goes all the way through physics to all sorts of political questions and so forth. Highlights the intellectual community of the 19th century with such good writing, even a hallmark with very, very well-tuned humor. It's an incredibly important read. He's a real intellectual scholar. We're honored to be able to have him here on November 5th, the eve of the presidential election. There's a lot going on. And so without further ado, I'll introduce Howard and ask him. He opens his mouth and wisdom comes out on so many different subjects. But I wonder maybe, Howard, you could just real quickly give a little background on yourself, and then let's get into a discussion. You were off talking about, we could talk about the book and some of the things you wanted to bring out in that. And then we'll talk for a while, and then we can get some round-robin questions going here. Welcome very, very much, and welcome. Let's all give him a good round of applause. Howard Bloom, amazing introduction.
Imagine I'm going to put you in my position. You're 10 years old. You're growing up in Buffalo, New York. It's a godforsaken town. There aren't a lot of intellectuals around. None of the kids in Buffalo like you. When you head down the block and it looks like you're going to come up the driveway when they're doing something in the backyard, they send a monitor down the driveway to keep you from even stepping onto the driveway, much less getting into the backyard with them. When they're playing baseball and they have to choose up sides and they see you coming down the street, they literally pick up all their equipment and find a new diamond so that they won't have to deal with you. You're not a popular kid in Buffalo, New York. And one day you're sitting in this great big living room of your parents' house. It's dark, the velvet curtains, you know how parents can be. They'll keep the living room absolutely sacred so nobody steps there unless you're having guests. So the dark velvet curtains are drawn, and there's a book in your hands, and you've never seen this book before. You know where every one of your parents' books are located, on the bookshelves. This one you've never seen before, and you'll never see it again. And it says to you two things. It says, the first rule of science is the truth at any price, including the price of your life. And it gives the example of Galileo, and it gives it all wrong. It tells you that Galileo would have gladly gone to the stake to defend his truth, that the earth moves around the sun, not the other way around. Turns out later in your life you'll find out that's not true. But thank God it gives you this mythologized version, because you need somebody to look up to. You need an example of courage. And the second rule of science it tells you is look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. Look at things that you and everybody around you take for granted. Look for things that you and everybody around you take for granted. And then look at them afresh and proceed from there. And it gives the example of Anton von Leeuwenhoek. Now, Anton von Leeuwenhoek was a draper, and he used he used a very high-tech device of his time, a new device, to look at the weave of the fabrics that he was importing from overseas, from the East. He decided that he could grind, since you ground your own lenses in those days, he decided that he could grind the lens in such a way that he could look at really, really tiny stuff. So he ground a lens to look at really, really tiny stuff, and he looked at a peculiar fluid. And he discovered in that peculiar fluid these things he called animalcules, these little tiny independent animals with little whip-like tails that were scooting around. Now, the book told you all of this, but it didn't tell you the following. What was Anton von Leeuwenhoek looking at? Where did he find the animalcules? He was looking at human sperm. Where did Anton von Leeuwenhoek in all probability get human sperm? Yes, exactly. So there was an act of courage here that even the book didn't tell you. A willingness to go and look at something that was utterly forbidden. And then to write the Royal Society, basically saying, I've masturbated, here's what's happened. So you have these two rules built into you, and it turns out that if you hang around with people like Galileo and Anton von Leeuwenhoek, they can't reject you. Do you know why? There's no way they can say, no, don't come up my driveway. They have to let you into their games. They're dead. They have no choice. This is the first social group you've ever been allowed into in your life. And science becomes your life. Cosmology becomes your life, theoretical physics. This is at the age of 10. Theoretical physics becomes your life, and microbiology becomes your life, period. And you start reading 2 books a day. You don't give a damn about what the teacher is saying in school. You just read, 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 read like a maniac. That is your new home. And at the age of 13, you make a wacky discovery. You read Bertrand Russell on God. And he explains to you why believing in God is absolutely silly. If it takes, yes, this is a very complex cosmos. If it takes a God to make a very complex cosmos like this, then God has got to be even more complex. And then who designed God? That's it. That's the end. That's what appeals to you. You suddenly discover you're an atheist, but you have a little problem. Your bar mitzvah is coming up. And it's going to be the first party you've ever been invited to. In fact, you are going to be the center of attention. And the gifts and checks are going to flow. And there's no way you want to screw up your bar mitzvah. So you do something remarkable. You compartmentalize this knowledge that you are an atheist. You keep it out of the center of your consciousness. It doesn't exist for you, even though you know it's there. But when the bar mitzvah is over, first of all, the bar mitzvah is just like every other event that's ever happened in your life. It's a bowling party. The kids get together in little groups of 4 or 6. None of those groups of 4 or 6 want to have you. You're left out even at your own party. But the gifts are terrific. And you know, you do get a bank account out of this, a small bank account. And then you're able to confess that you do not believe in God. But it's your birthday is June 25th. This is the very end of June. Only 2 months later, guess what happens on the Jewish calendar? Because you're Jewish. The high holidays. And your parents don't normally go to temple unless there's a wedding or a bar mitzvah or something. When it comes to the high holidays, that is sacred, period. As sacred as the living room. Maybe even more sacred than the living room. So your parents end up literally trying to drag you by the ankles out of their blue Fraser while you hold onto the door frame with your hands in order to get you to temple. You really do not want to go. And something occurs to you. Remember, the second law of science is look at things right under your noses that you've never seen before. Look for things that everybody around you and that you too take for granted as if you've never seen them before. And you suddenly realize what's under your nose is not under your nose, it's behind your nose. Because every tribe you've ever read about, and by now you've been reading about science nonstop for 3 years, and every tribe you've ever read about believes in some sort of supernatural forces, in something the equivalent of gods. So you suddenly realize if there are no gods above our heads, if there are no gods in the earth below, then where are the gods? Why are they so ubiquitous? Why are they everywhere? Because they have to be in here somewhere. And your mission becomes to find the gods inside of us. Another mission becomes, well, if no God made the universe, if no God said, let there be light, how in the world did we get light? If no God parted the heavens and the seas, how in the world did we get heavens and seas? How in the world did we get this incredibly complex cosmos with all of its psychology, all of its viciousness, all of its nastiness, all of its abundance, and all of its astonishments, if there is no God? That becomes another puzzle you're going to have to deal with. You're going to have to deal with it. Because it's you who've been tasked with this somehow. That's the obligation of scientists. Eventually, we'll skip over an awful lot of stuff, a tremendous amount of stuff. But eventually, you drop out of school, you hitchhike and ride the rails out on the West Coast looking for the beatniks. The beatniks don't turn out to be there. They've disappeared. It's 1961. They're gone. And other people, and you're seeking Zen Buddhist Satori. And other people think, I mean, all you have are questions. All you have is agony. and you're looking for an answer to the agony. But other people think you have an answer because of the determination with which you're pursuing Satori. So they start dropping out of their jobs and giving up on their mortgages and following you, hitchhiking and riding the rails. Eventually the movement that you helped crystallize totally by accident gets a name while you're out of the country. And it's Time Life magazine, the same magazine that gave us the beatniks, that named the beatniks, names your movement, calls it the hippie movement. But that's, and eventually you go back to school. Now, when you go back to school, you don't go back to school in science. Why? Because you've spent your whole life in science. You've spent, by now, when you go back to school, you're 21 years old, you spent 11 years of your life in science. That's a lot of time. But when you were a kid, when you were 12 years old, one day, a girl looked at you in class. Now, you haven't realized it until now, but nobody ever makes eye contact with you. Nobody ever looks at you. Not a soul. So when she looks at you, it's a shock. And not only does she look at you, she opens her mouth and talks to you, which just never, ever happens. And she says, you're in 8th grade, you're 12 years old, and she says, I told my mom that you understand the theory of relativity. Well, it's 1950 God knows what, and at that point, the theory of relativity is supposedly only understood by 7 men on the planet Earth. So, but you can't confess this. You cannot say, I do not understand the theory of relativity, because the only thing you have going for you is this reputation of being the sickly scientist, which is the name they make up for you, being some sort of a reasonable brain. And so you rush down to the library, where the librarians literally know you better than your mother does. And you park your bicycle outside, and you rush in, and you say, give me everything you've got on relativity. And the librarians, who are just wonderful to you and have been letting you have any book in the adult section that you've wanted ever since you were 10, find 2 books for you. And one is a little skinny blue book, and the other one is a great big fat book. And you start with a great big fat book because even though you're only 12 and a half years old, you realize that if you read something you don't understand a word of, and you are persistent and diligent enough, and you get all the way to the end, you end up understanding something you don't think you understood. So you are working your way through the great big fat book. It's all equations. It's a couple of words of English up here, a couple more words down here, all equations in between, and you don't understand equations. Nonetheless, you plow through the first 40 to 60 pages of this book, but then it's 8 o'clock at night. You have a realization, oh my God, my mom is going to put me to bed at 10 o'clock. You have 2 hours left in which to understand the theory of relativity or face humiliation the next day. So you start to read the skinny little book, which the first book was written by Albert Einstein and 2 collaborators. The skinny little book is by Albert Einstein alone. And have you ever had one of those experiences where an author seems to reach out from the page, grab you by the shirt, put his nose up to your nose, and give you a message? So Albert Einstein grabs you by the shirt and puts his nose to yours and said, schmuck, listen up. The word schmuck, by the way, does not necessarily appear in the book. It's there for dramatic contrast. But he says, to be a genius, it is not enough to have a theory only 7 men in the world can understand. To be a genius, you have to be able to have a concept only 7 men in the world can understand. And then you have to be able to put that theory so clearly and so deliciously that anyone with a high school education and a reasonable degree of intelligence can understand it. So Einstein, at the age of 12, has given you your marching orders. One of your tasks, find the gods inside, and find how the universe puts itself together without a God. Task number 2, learn to write. So when you go back to college, you go back as an English literature major in the hope that they will teach you how to write. You minor in psychology, and you especially get involved in something that will later be called neurobiology. You especially get involved in something at that point is called physiological psychology. Well, at the end of your 4 years, you graduate magna cum laude and Phi Beta Kappa and all that kind of stuff. You learn the tricks of getting straight A's, and you get straight A's for 3 years straight after making a couple of blunders and getting 2 B's your first year. Humiliates you. And you get 4 fellowships. The 4 fellowships are going to be in neurobiology and clinical psychology. And you have a sudden realization. First of all, your wife is tired of having student husbands. Her first husband was a student. You've been a student. for 3 years while you've been married and she just doesn't want to have anything to do with it anymore and you don't want to lose your wife. But it gives you an excuse. Why? Because you feel as if grad school is going to be Auschwitz for the mind. Why? Because your task is to find the gods inside of us. Your task is to find the incredible ecstasies and strange experiences that constitute those experiences of the divine that William James told you about when he also grabbed you by lapels in a book called The Varieties of the Religious Experience when you were 14 and said to you basically, look kid, I'm going to pretend that this is science. And I'm going to lay out a bunch of really extraordinary, exalting experiences for you. And I'm going to lay them out so vividly that you can feel them and you can want them. And I'm going to pretend it's science, but in reality, my science is not capable of understanding these things. But you're going to come along 70 years after me, and your job is going to be to use the science of your time to actually understand these experiences. So you realize that if you take one of these grad school fellowships, you're going to be giving paper and pencil tests to 22 kids at a time in the name of doing psychological research. And there is no way those 22 kids doing a paper and pencil test are going to experience the kind of exaltation that, for example, an Adolf Hitler used to build Germany, because he was a master of the gods inside, an absolute master of the gods inside. The gods inside. The gods inside. He was a master of the experiences of being exalted and carried into something higher than ourselves that justified all kinds of things because it was the ultimate in good. That's a practical use of the experience of divinity. And you have to know that. If you're interested in the forces of history and how to remake history, if you're interested in making sure there's never a Holocaust again, then you have to understand the forces that Hitler understood, even if he only understood them intuitively, and because you're a freaking scientist, you have to understand them in a way Hitler could never have articulated, period. You have to understand them within the broader framework of science. And you have to not only be capable of understanding these extraordinary experiences, you have to be capable of experiencing them, because you cannot turn them into mere dead specimens. It's the life inside of them that makes them what they are. And you know you're not going to accomplish this giving paper and pencil tests, which is what you're going to be limited to. You know, giving students paper and pencil tests in exchange for a credit toward their psychology, whatever it is, requirement. And you get a chance, you get a strange opportunity. You have been, your third year in school, the poet in residence apparently pulled you aside, you don't really remember it, and said, I want you on the staff of the literary magazine. Well, you hate literary magazines. They're these little dry turd-like things. They look so boring that they could suck all of the energy out of a room of incredibly lively people. You could put a group of people on amphetamines and put them into a room, and you would tranquilize them with the mere presence of a literary magazine. So you never show up. The second year, your junior year, he pulls you in once again, and he says, look, close the door. Okay, I'm telling you something. I'm not asking you to be on the staff of the literary magazine anymore. I'm telling you, you are the editor of the literary magazine. The minute you walk out of this office, you are the literary magazine. You don't have a faculty advisor, you have nothing, it's you, period. That's it, dismissed. And suddenly you discover yourself the editor of a literary magazine. And you want nothing to do with a literary magazine, even though he thinks you're going to be the next great poet out of NYU. So you stand in the corridor and you look utterly baffled. And a student comes along, and apparently in a school like this where they have amphitheaters with 120 students, if you're one of those students who dialogues in an interesting way with the professor, lots of people know you who you don't know. So a student walks up to you as if he knows you and says, what's the matter? You look very troubled about something. And you say, well, I've just been made the editor of the literary magazine. And he says, why don't you come down with me and have a cup of coffee? Now, you did not grow up around other human beings, remember that. You grew up with books and guinea pigs in your bedroom and laboratory rats in your bedroom. So you never heard of this ritual of have a cup of coffee before. Nonetheless, you go downstairs with him and have a cup of coffee, and he says, one of the most important questions that's ever been leveled at you. If you could do anything in life that you wanted, what would it be? Or anything you wanted with this magazine. And you say, turn it into a picture book. So you turn it into a combination literary magazine and experimental graphics magazine. And it wins all kinds of plaudits on campus. It's just amazingly successful. And so you don't want to go to grad school. Your wife doesn't want you to grad school. You have no good excuse for not going to grad school. You've got these 4 incredible fellowships, including at Columbia, where they've said you can do anything in the medical department so that you can get your hands on brains and do neurobiology that you want. And it's the end of the year. I mean, it's the end of school. You're supposed to go to Columbia for 2.5 months. You don't know what you're going to do with your summer yet. You walk into the apartment of one of your artists. He's sitting on the floor crying. His wife is sitting on the floor crying. Their baby is sitting on the floor crying. And there's no furniture in the apartment. And you ask what's wrong. And he says, they've repossessed our furniture and they're throwing us out of our apartment and they're turning off our electricity and they're turning off our telephone. And you say, but you're a brilliant artist. Look, I've got 2.5 months before I go to Columbia. I'll take your portfolio and I'll show it to people and I'll get you work. You'll have work in 2 weeks. And you start a commercial art studio. So with that commercial art studio, you get a periscope position that lets you into popular culture. And you've never paid attention to popular culture in your life. You listen to Rachmaninoff, Beethoven, Bartok, Stravinsky. You did not listen to rock and roll or any of that stuff. But you suddenly realize, I may be in the land where the gods are. I may be in the myth-making machinery of society. And to really get into that machinery, I want to get into, ultimately, television. So you use your periscope position to work your way in to popular culture until finally you found the biggest PR firm in the music industry, and you end up working with Prince and Michael Jackson and Bob Marley and Bette Midler and AC/DC and Aerosmith and Kiss and Queen and Run DMC and Paul Simon and Peter Gabriel and Billy Joel and Billy Idol and Jane Joan Jett and ZZ Top and all kinds of people like that. And you learn immense things about mass behavior, about mass passion, about mass emotion, about the forces of history, about the things that make up the mythologies in our time that reshape the very way the election that's taking place tomorrow, for example, is going to take place. So that's my background. In 1988, after doing this pop culture thing for 20 years, and then another problem, I needed to get out. I started going back to my science in 1981. I started writing a book in 1984. The book was half finished. I knew I wanted to get out of PR in the music industry and go back to my science full time and go back to this book stuff, but how do you pull that off? You know, you're a legend in your field. There are 20 pages on you in the Billboard Guide to Music Publicity, the leading textbook on music publicity in the business. Your wife certainly is not going to let you leave a profession that actually delivers money. Wives don't do that. And you have no clue. You have to get out. You know that. You have to go back to your science. That's you. But you have no excuse whatsoever. And then you come down with a really crippling illness. You come down with something that can't even be diagnosed. And within 6 months, for 3 months, you are so weak you cannot talk, and you stare at the ceiling, and you have no emotions. You're like Hal the computer. You know, when they take out the circuit boards to disable Hal, first they work on the very sophisticated circuit boards, and Hal is still able to put up arguments and say, Dave, don't do this, this is a big mistake. I'm the wisest one here, I'm the one who's keeping this all going. And finally, circuit board after circuit board after circuit board until you get to the circuit boards where Hal learned his first messages in life. And Hal is reduced from being this ultra-articulate computer to Mary had a little lamb. The very first thing. Well, you are reduced as if all the circuit boards in your brain have been pulled out. And for 5 years, you're too weak to talk. And you're stuck in bed, and you can't even have another person in your room. And the only thing that's left to you, what's that?
5 years?
5 years. Too weak to say a word. And you are reduced to, look, you're stripped of your humanity. You don't realize it until then, but you always carry with you a vision of your future and what you want to achieve. And when you are stripped of the very ability to have a person in the room with you or to walk any further than your bathroom, all of that disappears. And your sense of humanity disappears. Your very sense of what it is to be human. And you have to look over everything that's left to you and find how to build a life, a new personality, based on what's left to you. And the only thing that's left to you is your books. The books you are writing, and the only thing that's left to you is your science. And the only thing that's left to you is your mission that you were given at the very beginning of life. Truth at any price, including the price of your life. Look at things right under your nose as if you've never seen them before, and then proceed from there. Be an original scientific thinker, but write it so clearly that anybody with a high school education and a reasonable degree of intelligence can just understand it and can love it. that absolutely adore it. That's the only way you have to remain a human being on planet Earth. And so I was very fortunate to have this hideous, monstrous, 15-year-long illness. I was very fortunate to discover why the Chinese use solitary confinement as a torture, because it is a torture. And the pains that it creates, there are no words for in the English language. So, and if you're talking about, I mean, your goal, you were given another task by James, which is find the most extreme varieties of the human experience in order to find the religious experience. Because the religious experience, the human experience, the extremes, that's where you will find the truths that have been ignored. And you have certainly been forced into that by this monstrous, hideous illness.
How were you diagnosed as well?
I diagnosed myself, and I taught my doctor. It was chronic fatigue syndrome. And I taught my doctor about it, and it took 3 years to teach him. And he, since then, has been finding chronic fatigue syndrome all over the place. And how I got better is a very good question, because since I've been out of bed, I've been flown to speak to, I've been flown to Moscow, to Kuala Lumpur, to Seoul, Korea, to Chengdu, China, to Paris, and to Amsterdam to speak. So, you know, it's a miracle that I'm out. But how would I enjoy life to this extent if I hadn't had the contrast, the chiaroscuro of that hideous, monstrous 15 years? And how would I have ever followed the path that I needed to follow if I hadn't had the good luck of that illness? It's appalling. It's a strange life. And if there's any lesson in it, then the lesson is something that you probably know very well and that you probably know very well. And that is any cyclone that appears, looks like a disaster, your job is to throw a saddle over it and ride it. Period.
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yes, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, but it's your job to make sure that that's the way things happen. And believe me, the truth at any price, including the price of your life, and look at things right under your nose as you've never seen them before, those are vital survival mechanisms.
Would you say
Because
that again?
the truth at any price, including the price of your life, and look at things right under your nose that you and everybody around you take for granted, as if you've never seen them before, are vital survival mechanisms. Because being on the path of the truth will unleash your passions, and those passions will keep you alive. Those passions will keep you young. I'm 69 years old at this point, and the two of you are extraordinary examples of the fact that this is just, every day when you wake up is just the first day, the most important 20 years of your life. And 3 months ago, for the first time in my life, I did 220 push-ups. All in a row, without stopping. Last week I was doing 160.
Why would you do that?
Because you want to stay in shape. But I don't think that I would be able to do these things, Maggie, if it weren't for the fact that I'm doing what I think is the most important stuff in life, period. And the next task for me is to get to prime ministers and presidents. That's why I put together the Buzz Aldrin and Dr. A.P.J. Kalam thing. We did momentarily get to a president. Unfortunately, we muffed it. But if you come up with ideas that you think are significant and are able to save humans in some small or large way, it's your job to drive those things as far home as you possibly can, because it's your job. There are no saviors except us. And it's your job to be every savior you ever dreamed of. Period.
The first and foremost is to be able to be the savior of yourself.
That's right. And that's not easy. That's not easy at all.
So where would these solar panels go exactly, on the International Space Center?
No, they would be erected in big arrays that are several kilometers in,
Howard,
yeah,
when did that start?
which one, with the illness?
No.
The solar panels?
You was talking, yeah.
The concept of solar energy is credited to Peter Glaser, and that was the 1980s.
1980s.
Right.
1980s.
Right.
Okay.
And a man named Gerard O'Neill at Princeton University then managed to get this into the New York Times Sunday magazine. You probably saw it. I know I saw it there for the first time. And Robert O'Neill got across two concepts. He got across the concept of harvesting solar power in space and sending it down to Earth. And he got across the concept of what is now called an O'Neill colony. Imagine a giant tin can in the sky, made of glass and steel, rotating so it produces gravity big enough to house 30,000 people or 130,000 people.
Okay, now, my, my thinking when I was listening to you, that's why I wanted to ask you about the date of that. Simply because when you're talking about the atmosphere and the solar and the machines that go up there and the Muhunaha, etc., they require certain elements of their creativity, of their engineering to be able to do what they do.
Right.
Okay. Many elements, all the elemental scale,
Right.
Now, it's curious that in 1980, when I was working with the United Nations, they had something called the Law of the Sea.
Oh,
which
yes.
was very extraordinary.
Right.
In the sense that there was a whole little cabal that realized there were far more minerals to be had under the water than there were on top.
Right.
Now, having gone through this whole entire conference with the United Nations, it came down to one question.
Right.
Who was able to garner from the minerals of an open ocean?
Right.
Now, gosh, you had countries that had a 3-mile limit,
Right.
a 300-mile limit.
Right.
Okay, now, fine. Anything is free game from 300 miles, let us say. Let us give all the countries 300 miles around.
Right.
Even if it's a little island they do. Now, who's able to go down and farm the minerals or mine the minerals of the ocean bottom? And in particular, with this particular UN conference, it was about magnesium geodes.
Right.
A considerable piece of mineral required to go into.
Right.
But who's to garner from a free pirating of the seabeds?
Well, this is a big
Should
question.
it not be
Yeah.
everybody's earth right to have profit from harvesting the seabed, whatever minerals it is? No, it apparently was the capitalists who were able to make the machines able to harvest it. Well, we can do it. Well, we got it. Goodbye.
What's
So,
the question?
The point is,
Oh, fine.
the point is, you can't go up there without being able to garner here.
Well, actually, putting up a bunch of rockets is going to take far less material than, to go back to my cell phone, than making a bunch of these cell phones.
Right, and so now you have little cell phones that require certain little chemicals, and only certain places in the earth
Right.
have these little chemicals, one of which big resource is China.
Right.
And so you have a monopoly. Now, you think they're going to be largesse?
Now, we've already seen that the Chinese are manipulating their rare earth minerals and their availability to have clout, to achieve the kinds of things they want to achieve. And we've also seen that there's been a rise of nationalism in China, and we've seen anti-Japanese riots in the last 6 months in China, and we've seen increasing confrontation between Japan and China in the South China Sea. But the point, one of the
For
points
those
of one,
islands.
what's that?
For those islands.
Yes, for those islands, at a time when the world is teetering in strange ways, because the difficulties in Syria are not limited to Syria. Look, I've been into geopolitics since I was a kid, and I've been on Saudi TV twice doing geopolitical commentary, and I've been on Iranian TV 6 times, and I debated one-on-one with a senior official from Hamas and a senior official from the Muslim Brotherhood. And right now, the world system is stacked something like this. Syria is allied with Iran.
Alive
Um,
and wrong.
Yes.
Yes,
Iraq
well,
has
I'm
basically
wrong.
been taken by Iran, using us
But
as
say
the
that
taker.
again?
Iraq is basically considered an Iranian territory right now. Iran, that's according to the head of the Quds unit, which is their foreign, it's their foreign, how would we put it? It's their army for manipulating things in foreign countries, is the Quds unit.
The Quds unit is what? From when?
It's part of the IRG, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. And at any rate, the point is that you've got a lineup here where Syria is with Iran. Iran is with Russia. Russia, until recently, said it basically had a military alliance, the equivalent of NATO, that lines up Russia, China, Iran, and Syria. So as far as the Russians were concerned up until about 3 months ago, if anything happens with Syria, then they will step in the same way that these giant alliances were triggered in World War I by a tiny little incident.
I mean, Russia will go into Syria?
Russia considers Syria a vital part of its national interests. Plus, this is not a civil war in Syria. This is in part a civil war, but it's even more a war between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And the Saudi Arabians are the only men left standing of the old Arab League. For a long time, when Iraq, this is a long and very different story than I was anticipating discussing, but it's an interesting
Well, the Arab
one.
League was, way back in the 20s.
Well, but they still have, there's still been a long-lasting alliance between Egypt and Saudi Arabia, and Syria used to be a vital part of that, but has been pried away. So as far as the Saudis are concerned, they have been encircled by the Iranians. And as far as the Saudis are concerned, they are on their last legs. It's the end of Islam. What do they mean by the end of Islam? Sunni Islam is Islam, and Shiite Islam is heresy. It's demonic. So,
Oh, we gotta go into that stuff again?
well, this is what's happening in your world, Maggie.
Yeah, but what's gonna happen with the Persian/Arabian Gulf with the Hormuz Straits? Nobody's gonna be able to function.
That's
going
right.
on there.
That's right. That's why this is something to be very aware of.
Anybody,
But it connects to
even
the
all
South
the
China
Emirates
Sea.
and Qatar, they're not gonna be able to function.
That's
You
true.
close that strait,
And yet they are the backers of the Syrian opposition, because the attempt at regime change in Syria is an attempt to pry Syria away from
All
Iran
right.
and bring it back to the Arab
Magna.
bloc.
let's roll this one.
Okay.
Do you think the Iranians, being the Shias that they are going to absolutely reclaim Ali's, what you call his death by treason, and take over the Kaaba in Mecca?
They tried. They tried
You
in.
mean,
They tried very shortly
You're
after
gonna
the Iranian
switch off?
Revolution already. Remember, there was a group of armed men who were holed up in the Kaaba very shortly after the Iranian Revolution, trying to take over Mecca.
they're still fighting that ding-dong thing?
Well, here's the deal, Maggie. When Iran had its revolution, the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the George Washington and Thomas Jefferson of the revolution, because he wrote all of the revolutionary documents that established the philosophy. And this Islam, you have to understand, I'm switching my role to being a Muslim for a moment. Islam is not a religion that allows for a bunch of separate states. Those are Western concepts. Those are divisions the West has inflicted on Islam. The most important word in Islam is one. There is one God. There is one people. There is one Ummah. So we're talking about right now the philosophy of both Osama bin Laden on the Sunni side and of what's his name on the Iranian side. Khomeini, right. And so when the revolution happened, they did not call it the Iranian Revolution.
Wait,
They-
you're telling me that Khomeini and Osama bin Laden?
Have nothing to do with each other except a common elements of philosophy. They would hate each other, they would both regard each other as heretics.
They would not go to war against each other.
Would they have at various times? What do you think all those killings are about in Iraq and all the bombings that are taking place in Afghanistan? Many of them are Sunni versus Shiite.
Is this just a tool to come together for an outside enemy, i.e. the
No,
infidels?
not at all. No. The most important word in Islam is one. And that means
Theoc-
one
It's a
people.
theocracy,
Yes,
very much so.
right.
Always has been.
Well, it's a military theocracy. It's a
Well,
military
that goes
dictatorship
with the
theocracy.
territory.
Because Muhammad was a military dictator and a totalitarian. And you had to
He
do
didn't
everything
slice
his
his
way.
way to Medina for
What's
nothing.
that?
He didn't slice his way to Medina for nothing.
Well, he actually sliced his way from Medina back to Mecca.
Mecca.
Yeah,
Okay.
right.
Reverse course.
So, but the point is that you've got this setup right now where you've got stress in the South China Sea. The Chinese are claiming that there is something, I think they call their sphere of trade influence or something like that. And it extends way out into the oceans. And they're claiming islands that are claimed by Taiwan, that are claimed by Japan, that are claimed by the Philippines, that are claimed by Vietnam. And right now the Chinese are pressing on the Japanese. And there were anti-Japanese riots sponsored by the government over the course of the last 3 months in China that forced the Japanese to shut down their car companies temporarily, stop production, because it was dangerous for them. It was very dangerous. And this confrontation is going on today.
Why danger?
Why danger?
To stop production?
Because this is a military confrontation.
You mean they were going to blow up the auto factory?
No. Within China, I mean, have you followed any of this, Summer?
Yes, of course.
Yeah,
As a matter
so-
of fact, I made 4 films for Taiwan, so I'm very interested by it. Actually, I wrote to the Taiwan government suggesting I make a film of it.
Right. Well, to pull out to the bigger picture for a minute. Okay, well, to put you back in my position,
Okay,
your job is to see the big picture.
trying to.
Yeah, and as a consequence, and when we talk about finding the varieties of the religious experience, and when we talk about finding the myth-making machinery of modern culture, which is what you did when you went into pop music, you tried to get an insight into that, both a visceral insight and an intellectual insight. And all of that relates to foreign policy. Why? Because the foreign policy picture is the forces of history at work. And it is the manipulation of these psychological elements, some of which are positively ecstatic, that Hitler used. I spent years reading everything that Osama bin Laden ever wrote. And I spent years doing it because I wanted to be able to put myself in his head. I wanted to be able to think and feel like Osama bin Laden. And it worked. Now, Sun Tzu says that you need to do that in order to succeed militarily. You need to be able to walk in the shoes of your enemy. But my science says you need to be able to walk in the shoes of everyone on the planet to understand what's going on. And my science tells me you need to be able to put together the big picture. That's what you're really here for. One of the pictures right under your nose, Maggie, is the big picture.
Howard,
Yeah.
speaking of the big picture.
Yeah, what do you mean the big
Talk
picture?
talk a little bit about the universe.
Okay, the universe. There's a new theory of the beginning, middle, and end of the universe in this book. And it's a theory that explains 2 big mysteries in theoretical physics and cosmology today. One is dark energy, which is an utterly baffling mystery right now. The other is called the parity problem. The parity problem goes back to the 1950s, and it's if matter and antimatter are created in equal amounts at the same time, why is there so much matter in this universe and so little antimatter? Okay? And this theory is a toroidal theory of the universe. It's a bagel. It's called the Big Bagel. A toroid is a donut, basically, in topology. And Jerry, you would know this stuff because you've been teaching mathematics. Okay, so let's imagine this. Imagine a big donut, okay? And imagine that it has an infinitesimally tiny little hole. You've seen those irritating little holes that are so anally retentive, it's ridiculous. Now, imagine it's the beginning of the universe. There is a Big Bang. Exploding on the top of the bagel, from the bagel's center, is our universe, the normal universe. Exploding on the underside of the bagel is an anti-universe, the antimatter universe. These two universes, they expand at an extremely rapid rate. That's what's shown by a bagel has a steep slope going up from the hole. And steepness represents speed in math. This is called an Einsteinian space-time manifold. So you've got this rapid expansion, but then like a cannonball running out of steam, you get up to the top of the bagel and things ease off. The speed slows down. Things are still parting from each other. The universe is still expanding, but not expanding as fast as it was when it was on this steep slope. Then what happens? The universe starts to slide down. The matter universe starts to slide down the bagel's outer perimeter. And so does the antimatter universe. Now, why would the antimatter universe and the matter universe slide toward each other? Why would they be attracted to each other? Why would they start to slide downward toward the bagel's outer periphery? They share a language. It's called gravity.
But what happened before the Big Bang?
Okay, this is this is a very good question. And in this book, it is confronted in a rather indirect manner. And the indirect manner goes something like this. We'll take you back to your own history. And where's Maggie?
She's getting blood.
Okay, because we're doing all of this in the form of a story. So it's illustrating what Maggie was interested in, which is why story is a good explanatory device. Okay, so you are 19 years old. Your parents have sent you off to Reed College in Portland, Oregon. It's 1961. Your class has the highest median SATs of any school in the country, higher than Harvard, higher than Caltech, higher than MIT. You arrive for your first day in math class. You have no idea what to expect. You're sitting there with a dozen other students at a big conference table waiting for the teacher. You smell the teacher coming before you see her. Why? Because she's carrying mimeograph sheets of paper. And she walks in, she hands this little stack of paper to the person on her right, the student on the right, asks him to pass it around, he passes it around, you get your sheet. You look at this thing, and it's only a half a page of type. It's 165 words. But your job for the rest of the year is every week to extract a new implication from the 165 words on that piece of paper. The 165 words are almost impossible to understand, but there are 5 simple rules. They're called Piano's axioms. And by the end of Piano's axioms, right, Giuseppe Piano. And from those 5 axioms, over the course of the year, if you're only 1 in 10 students is capable of doing this homework, this puts you in a remarkably good position. Girls have never wanted to have anything to do with you, never had a date in your life. And all of a sudden, there are girls who are desperate for help with their homework. So who do you think they come to? Well, they come to you. Now, they leave you for a superior man of some sort as soon as the homework is done, but at least you get some attention from them, and you've never had that before, so you're perfectly happy. But the point is, by the end of the year, you have extracted from these 165 words the entire natural number system. Positive numbers, negative numbers, multiplication, addition, subtraction, squares, square roots. Everything you learned in your first 8 years of grammar school. Everything that took 18 pounds worth of textbooks to learn. How the hell did 165 words contain implicit within them a system 8 textbooks high? That's your puzzle. However, you come up with a theory. It's called corollary generator theory. And in essence, it goes like this. Supposing the universe is like a student at Reed College doing her homework. And supposing that instant by instant by instant, she's extracting implications from a set of simple rules. And you pursue that concept for the rest of your life, and you particularly pursue it in this book. And it turns out there's an awful lot of evidence that this could be the case. Awful lot of evidence that this could be the case. But to do it and to write about it, you're stuck with a puzzle. You need to be, if you're going to write this damn book and it's going to be based on your experience with Peano's axioms, you're going to have to be able to explain Peano's axioms. So you have your assistant call Reed College, find out exactly what those 165 words were. You look them up all over the place in many different forms, and in every single form, they're incomprehensible. And what did Einstein tell you? You have to write everything so brilliantly and so deliciously that anybody with a high school education and a reasonable degree of intelligence can understand it, and there's no way in hell you're going to be able to make this stuff understandable. So you decide to take another approach. You wonder what an axiom is, and where the concept of an axiom came from, and what the story is behind Peano's axioms. So you go back to the beginning, and it takes you to the beginnings of math. Okay, well you figure you're going to be able to cover this in 2 pages. This is easy. In Jericho, and 11,000 years ago, some wise guy came up with this ridiculous idea of taking these big things that got in your path all the time, that you stumbled over, called stones, and rolling them together, and rolling them together by the thousands. And he claimed that if you roll enough of them together, you could create a big circular structure that would defend you from your enemies. Nobody could get through to you with a bow and arrow anymore. Nobody could get to you with a spear anymore. Nobody could get to you with a dagger anymore. Now this is somewhere, this has got to be a ridiculous idea. You know this has got to be a ridiculous idea. It's going to take you years to gather all the boulders, this guy says, and obviously boulders are boulders are boulders. They're not going to make it into walls, but you build this stone wall, and sure enough, you invent the first city. It's Jericho. It's 11,000 years ago. So now you, as the author, figure, okay, the walls in Jericho were round, the buildings in Jericho were round, so people in Jericho had circles. That's easy. That's the beginning of mathematics. And then you know that another madman in Mesopotamia came up with, actually it was Turkey, came up with this ridiculous idea. There was this appalling toxic waste. If you've ever been in the Middle East in this rainy season and you've been out in the countryside, the mud is up to your knees. And you suddenly realize how vulnerable you can be to mud. And that if you didn't have sufficient strength, you might get caught out in this stuff and become another bog man. There are bog people buried in mud that we found, mostly in Ireland. But this stuff is dangerous. And some nutcase comes up with the idea that you can take this and pat it into rectangular forms. Rectangular forms? What are rectangular forms? There's never been a rectangular form before, never in the cosmos has there ever been a rectangular form. But this guy claims not only that you can pat this weird goop, this toxic mess, into rectangular forms, but you put it out in the sun to dry, and if you make 60 million of them, you can make an apartment complex. What? There's no such thing as an apartment. There's no such thing as these rectangular things you're talking about. There's no such thing as the kind of wall that you built. Okay, you, writing about this, realize that it's the guys who came up with this wild idea and actually managed to persuade people to go through 30 years of making 60 million of these things. I mean, that's really carrying a vision and promoting it like hell. But somehow somebody did it. And the result was the second major city, Hayuk, which has big garden apartment complexes with 3-room apartments. It's amazing. And this is 8,000 years ago. So you figure, okay, the people in Hayuk, after all, they had flat walls for the very first time in the history of the cosmos. Flat walls. And walls that met at right angles for the very first time in the history of the cosmos. So you figure, okay, so these guys have the concept of a plane, you know, what Euclidean geometry is all about, the flat surface, and the concept of the angle. And then you run into a problem. Every textbook, every reference book that you consult tells you that the Babylonians came up with the concept of the angle and came up with the concept of 360 degrees. So you, being, you know, you've got this Einsteinian imperative. You have to write something so clearly that anybody with a high school education would understand it. So you want to be able to give your reader a feeling what it was to hold a Babylonian protractor in your hands. And you want to know whether the protractors were made of clay, or wood, or copper, or something else. And for a month, you hunt everywhere. You know, with Google Book Search these days, you can literally hunt through hundreds of books in half an hour. And you hunt through every book you can possibly find, and you cannot find what they made their damn protractors out of. And it bothers the hell out of you. And meanwhile, you're kicking yourself in the ass. And you're saying to yourself, dummy, why are you so obsessed with this? Any person with a reasonable degree of intelligence would go on to something more important and not get obsessed with this tiny little detail for an entire month. And then something occurs to you. You cannot find what the material was of the Babylonian protractor because no such thing ever existed. And then the scales fall from your eyes. You realize they did not have the circle in Jericho. Yes, they had circular things, but they never had the concept of the circle that we have in our heads. And in Hayuk, yes, they had flat walls. Yes, they had 90-degree angles. They didn't have a clue as to what an angle is, much less a 90-degree angle. They hadn't invented the concept. You have to upload one of the everyday things in your life. It's that second rule of science, look at things right under your nose. You have to upload the things right under your nose up here to the toolkit of the mind and turn them into concepts. And that's not easy. That's a difficult proposition. And you realize the Babylonians were weird as hell. They didn't think we had a round sky because they had no concept of a circle at all. They didn't invent the angle, not a bit. Yes, they had to make not perfect 90-degree angles because they built ziggurats and all kinds of other buildings. And if the angles weren't perfect, the buildings would fall apart. And the guy who hired you to put the building together, who tended to be a monarch of some sort, would be rather harsh on you if the building built in his name to impress all of his enemies and all of his friends fell apart. They did 90-degree angles, and they didn't know the concept of the 90-degree angle. To them, in fact, astronomy, they invented astronomy, right? We all know the Babylonians invented astronomy. The fact is, their version of astronomy was not looking at the sky. They did not look up. For one thing, the sky was a flat roof as far as they were concerned, because remember, they didn't have the idea of the circle, much less the hemisphere or the sphere itself. And to them, what counted in their math was that point at which a body rose, like the moon or the sun on the horizon. That was it for them. The idea of looking up, sorry, didn't exist. So you realize that other people have thought in ways dramatically, weirdly, alienly different from ours. And that we are the beneficiaries of so many inventions that come from looking at things right under your nose and reinventing them as mind tools, as concepts. That is ridiculous. But you also realize that if we had been handed the mind tools of the angle, the circle, and a bunch of other things like that, it's our job to now perceive the things right under our nose and take them from the realm of things we use every day to mental tools. Because we're now the ones responsible for turning out the mind tools for the future. So that's a little bit of the book was, I can't get it across to the extent to which it was an adventure. It was an amazing adventure. I mean, I discovered that Bertrand Russell in his History of Philosophy, one of the many people who said that the Babylonians invented the 360-degree angle was wrong. Kepler didn't know any math. Not by our standards. Kepler, if you look through all of Kepler's work for the famous 3 laws of planetary motion that Kepler came up with, you won't find them. Because they're a later interpretation of Kepler, using tools that Kepler did not have. Kepler did not use equations. He'd never heard of them. Kepler used geometry. He used drawing triangles within circles. So this book takes you into some very alien minds in order to get you to re-perceive the things that you take for granted in everyday life. And see not just how fragile they are, but how primitive they are compared to what they could be someday, if only we make the contributions that we need to make. So that's a little bit of what this book, just a little bit of what this book
I
is all
wanted
about.
to ask you about this idea of a godless cosmology.
Yes.
It seems to me that you are pointing to this process that is going on as what I would call the mysterium tremendum.
Yes, that sounds like a good phrase.
Huh?
Yes.
And when you are talking about the godlessness, are you really talking about the God of the Bible or of some other conventional religions? Or do you have also in mind that there is a possibility of seeing the creative process in nature as something that, if you wish, you could call God? You don't have to, but if you would,
No, I
it would
absolutely.
be also justified.
Yes, I
And
would-
Howard,
if one, yeah.
Howard, if you hold that thought,
Just do it. Just
I'm going to
change.
change the tape. And
Okay.